They did not know its name. They did not know its cause. All they knew was that death had come to their world. It arrived not with thunder, nor with a roar, but with a whisper carried across the sea, hidden in the belly of ships, in the fur of rats, in the bite of fleas. It was the year 1347, and the first warnings came to the port city of Messina in Sicily. Ships from the east drifted into the harbor, but what they carried was not silks, spices, or treasure. It was pestilence. The sailors aboard were already half dead, their bodies covered with dark swellings that oozed foul pus. Dock workers rushed to unload the cargo, but the stench of death clung to everything, to the planks of the ships, to the rats that scurried ashore, and to the fleas that leapt from host to host. Within days, Messina was struck. Within weeks, the plague had leapt across Italy. News traveled slower than death. Rumors spread that the disease came from the east, from the Mongol lands. Some whispered of a siege at Kaffa, a trading port on the Black Sea, where Mongol armies hurled plague-ridden corpses over the walls to infect the defenders. Whether myth or truth, it did not matter. What mattered was this: from the east came death, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers, and Europe was unprepared. In the beginning, there was denial. Villagers thought the strange swellings and sudden deaths were isolated misfortunes, but then entire households fell in a single night. Priests summoned to give last rites succumbed before they could finish their prayers. Towns that welcomed travelers soon found themselves cursed. The symptoms were unmistakable. Victims developed painful buboes, swollen lumps the size of apples growing in the armpits, neck, and groin. Fever and chills racked their bodies. Their skin darkened, turning a sickly black, giving the plague its infamous name. Some coughed blood, and those who did were usually dead within 3 days. The sight alone was terrifying. People spoke of bodies piled on carts, of streets where no one dared walk, of homes sealed shut because everyone inside was already dead. In cities, the bells tolled endlessly for funerals, until the gravediggers themselves collapsed from exhaustion or from the plague itself. By the autumn of 1347, the plague traveled beyond Sicily, carried north by trade routes and sea lanes. Genoa and Venice soon fell, their bustling markets silenced. Ships became floating coffins, drifting from port to port, spreading contagion wherever they anchored. In Marseille and Pisa and Florence, the story was the same. Healthy men and women struck down in days, families torn apart, fear gripping every household. Merchants tried to flee inland, but the plague rode with them. Soldiers too carried it into the countryside. There was no refuge. What made the plague different from other diseases was not just its lethality, it was its speed, its mystery, its scale. One day, a family dined together, laughing and drinking. By the next morning, 2 were dead, the others already showing symptoms. Neighbors stopped visiting one another. Priests hesitated to enter plague-ridden homes. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. Fear became stronger than love. In some towns, survivors fled to the countryside, hoping the fresh air would spare them. But the plague followed. The cities emptied. Fields lay untended. Churches grew silent, except for the muffled sobs of the few who dared bury their dead. By early 1348, the plague had crossed into France. Paris trembled as the death carts rolled through the narrow streets. In Avignon, the Pope ordered massive bonfires in hopes that the smoke would cleanse the air. But no ritual, no fire, no prayer stopped the spread. That same year, the plague leapt across the English Channel. In Dorset, the first victims fell, followed swiftly by London. Chroniclers wrote of corpses stacked like cordwood, of graveyards overflowing, of pits dug outside the city walls to contain the endless dead. By now, the entire continent knew this was no ordinary sickness. This was a scourge, a punishment, a shadow that spared no man, woman, or child. In every village and city, the same question rose: why? Why had God abandoned them? Why had the heavens unleashed such wrath? Doctors, priests, and scholars argued endlessly. Some blamed corrupted air, others pointed to astrological alignments. Many believed it was divine punishment for the sins of mankind. but explanations were hollow in the face of the corpses piling higher each day. Fear turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into violence. Soon, desperate eyes searched for scapegoats, outsiders, the poor, and especially the Jewish communities of Europe. But that is a shadow that deepened in the years that followed. For now, all Europe could do was watch as death advanced unstoppable, merciless, silent as a thief in the night. It began as a whisper, a ship rocking gently in a harbor, its crew groaning in agony. But that whisper grew into a roar that consumed a continent. In just a few short years, the Black Death would kill tens of millions, leaving villages deserted, cities in silence, and faith itself shaken to its core. The plague was not merely a disease, it was a force that reshaped the destiny of Europe, etching scars that time itself could never fully erase. And as the whisper grew into a roar, it did not stop. The pestilence, once confined to a handful of ports, now surged like a tidal wave, crashing over mountains, rivers, and kingdoms. What Europe had first glimpsed in Sicily was now fully unleashed. The Black Death no longer knocked quietly at the door, it tore it from its hinges and stormed inside. By the year 1348, there was no escape. The plague raced along trade routes, slipped across borders, and struck towns before word of its arrival could even reach them. Florence, Paris, London all fell in turn, as the pestilence devoured life faster than the living could bury the dead. The Black Death was not only killing Europe, it was dismantling it. The Black Death moved with a swiftness that terrified even the most hardened chroniclers. In Florence, the great writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched in horror as neighbors and friends vanished within days. He wrote of people struck suddenly, their bodies swelling, their blood coughing from their lungs, their lives extinguished before hope could arrive. It was not just the dying that terrified, it was the pace. One man fell sick in the morning and was dead before night. Entire families perished in a single week. Villages once alive with laughter stood silent, doors sealed, livestock wandering untended. The disease spared no one, rich, poor, noble, or peasant. Even kings and bishops trembled, for their crowns and robes offered no protection. The great cities of Europe, Florence, Paris, London, became chambers of horror. Streets once bustling with markets and festivals turned into avenues of despair. Corpses lay abandoned in houses until neighbors, terrified of contamination, nailed the doors shut. The air grew heavy with the stench of rotting flesh. Church bells tolled constantly, not for weddings or feasts, but for funerals that came one after another. Gravediggers could not keep pace. In many places, cemeteries overflowed, forcing towns to dig mass pits holes filled with hundreds of bodies, stacked like logs, covered hastily with dirt before more corpses arrived. Chroniclers wrote of carts trundling through the streets, their drivers shouting for the living to bring out your dead. The sight was so common, it became normal. Death had moved in like a neighbor who would never leave. As the pestilence raged, desperation gave way to madness. Some sought salvation in isolation, locking themselves in country villas, believing distance would shield them. Others turned to indulgence, claiming that since death was certain, they might as well drink, feast, and abandon restraint. In the cities, crime surged in strange ways. Families stole from each other, neighbors robbed the sick, priests abandoned their flocks. Yet in other corners, fear birthed piety. People flocked to churches, begging priests for absolution, though many priests themselves perished. Some believed processions of prayer could drive the plague away. Instead, the gatherings only fueled its spread. From Italy, the plague spread north, sweeping into France, Spain, Switzerland, and Germany. In Spain, villages emptied as peasants fled to the mountains. In France, Paris was gripped with such terror that even doctors dared not touch their patients, instead pointing at them with sticks. By the summer of 1348, England too had become a land of mourning. The plague entered through Dorset, then struck London, where as many as half the city perished. Chroniclers wrote of parents deserting children, of brothers abandoning brothers, of society itself breaking under the weight of fear. The pestilence was no longer a rumor from distant lands. It was everywhere, an invisible enemy, striking without warning, killing without mercy. What terrified most was the body itself. The swelling buboes, the blackened skin, the coughing of blood, these were not just symptoms. They were a transformation, as if the body itself had been claimed by some dark force. Victims moaned in agony, their families recoiling in fear, their neighbors whispering that this was no disease but a curse from God. Some tried desperate cures, herbs, leeches, bathing in vinegar, even drinking potions of crushed emeralds. Others lit fires to purify the air, or carried posies of flowers to mask the stench of death. But nothing worked. The pestilence laughed at their efforts, sweeping on, relentless and cruel. Law and order collapsed. Courts stopped functioning, trade halted, armies dissolved. Kings retreated to isolated castles, hoping to outlast the storm, but even their walls could not keep it out. Ships rotted in harbors, their sailors long dead. Markets stood abandoned, bread ovens cold, workshops silent. The bonds of society trust, family faith shattered. It was as if the world itself had broken. The plague was no longer a whisper, nor even a storm. It was a flood, drowning everything in its path. Entire villages vanished from the map. Cities shrank into graveyards. Europe stood on the edge of collapse, its very survival uncertain. The Black Death was not just killing people, it was unmaking the world they had known. The plague was not just killing people, it was unmaking the world they had known. And in the ruins it left behind, fear grew into something darker. For when reason failed and medicine proved powerless, people turned to superstition, to desperate explanations that demanded desperate answers. In the silence of abandoned streets, in the echo of church bells tolling endlessly, whispers began to spread, whispers of punishment, curses, and conspiracies. In Paris, scholars argued that the alignment of the planets had poisoned the air. In Florence, priests declared that mankind's sins had drawn down the wrath of God. In the villages of Germany, rumors spread that wells had been poisoned, not by chance but by human hands. The plague had struck so suddenly, so cruelly, that people could not accept it as mere misfortune. They needed someone, or something, to blame. And so suspicion turned outward. Across Europe, Jewish communities became the targets of rage. Accused of poisoning wells and spreading disease, entire populations of Jews were massacred, burned alive, drowned, or driven from their homes. In Strasbourg, thousands were killed in a single day, their bodies consumed by fire while the crowd looked on. The plague had unleashed not just death, but hatred. Fear made neighbors into enemies, friends into executioners. The disease was invisible, but the scapegoats were not, and punishing them felt like action, even if it did nothing to stop the dying. For many, the plague was a sign of divine judgment. The sins of mankind, greed, lust, blasphemy, had brought about the end of days. Preachers thundered from pulpits that only repentance could save them. Some communities organized processions of prayer, carrying relics, chanting hymns, begging God for mercy. But these gatherings only fueled the contagion, spreading the plague faster, leaving behind more corpses than converts. Still, the belief remained. If death was everywhere, then surely it was because God had abandoned them. Out of this despair came the Flagellants, roving bands of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges until blood streamed down their backs. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could atone for the sins of the world and turn away God's wrath. They entered cities chanting hymns, their songs echoing against stone walls as they lashed themselves in public squares. People wept, believing they were witnessing holy sacrifice. Others recoiled, seeing madness where others saw piety. The church itself grew uneasy, fearing the Flagellants more than the plague, for their fanaticism threatened to undermine its authority. Everywhere, superstition blossomed. Amulets and charms were sold in the marketplaces. Herbal concoctions were whispered to ward off death. Some carried bouquets of roses or lavender, believing sweet smells would protect them from the corrupted air. Others turned to astrology, begging the stars to explain their fate. Cats and dogs were slaughtered in some towns, accused of carrying the pestilence. Ironically, killing the cats only worsened the spread, for the rats multiplied unchecked. But in the frenzy of fear, Logic had no place. The plague tore at the very foundation of faith. Many clung to the church, begging for forgiveness, but others looked at the priests, many of whom fled their duties or died themselves, and began to doubt. How could God allow such suffering? Why did prayers go unanswered? For some, the plague strengthened belief. For others, it shattered it forever. Out of this crisis, new ways of thinking about the world began to stir, seeds that, in time, would grow into the Renaissance. The plague was not only a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of the mind, a poison of fear that spread faster than the disease itself. It drove people to murder their neighbors, to whip themselves bloody in the streets, to believe that salvation could be found in ashes and screams. Death had remade their world, but superstition was remaking their souls. And as terror deepened, Europe's society bent toward collapse, teetering between despair and transformation. Superstition had poisoned the soul of Europe, but the plague was still not finished. Terror and suspicion were corrosive, yet the pestilence itself remained the sharpest blade. And under its ceaseless strike, the structures of society, family, church, law, and community began to disintegrate. It began in the home. Families that once gathered around hearths now crumbled beneath the weight of fear. Parents abandoned children, showing the first signs of sickness. Children deserted their elders, fleeing in hopes of survival. Love, that oldest of human bonds, was shattered by terror. Chroniclers described fathers refusing to bury their sons, mothers abandoning daughters in locked houses. Where once kinship had been sacred, now only survival mattered. Villages across Europe withered into silence. Crops rotted in the fields because no one was left to harvest them. Mills stopped turning, bakeries grew cold, and cattle wandered freely without shepherds. Some settlements disappeared altogether, their last survivors either dead or fled, leaving only ruins and weeds where once there had been laughter and life. In England, entire parishes vanished. In France, tax records showed whole communities erased from existence. The map of Europe itself seemed to shrink, not by conquest, but by emptiness. Governments too faltered. Courts stopped convening. Tax collectors dared not ride into infected villages. Armies deserted their posts, soldiers preferring to die at home than on the battlefield. Kings and nobles retreated into isolation, but even their castles could not shield them from the invisible enemy. Justice crumbled. With sheriffs and judges gone, crime flourished. Thieves prowled the roads, robbing the sick and plundering abandoned homes. In some places, bandits ruled where kings had once commanded. The Black Death had undone centuries of order in a matter of months. Nowhere was the collapse more visible than in the church. Priests and monks had been the spiritual anchors of medieval life, but the plague struck them as mercilessly as any peasant. Monasteries emptied, abbeys grew silent, churches locked their doors. Priests who remained often fled the dying rather than risk infection. The faithful, who had once believed salvation, lay in sacraments, now found those sacraments absent. The church's authority faltered as people questioned its power and its compassion. If holy men could not protect them, then what was left to believe in? Trust itself, the glue of society, dissolved. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Travelers were driven from town gates with stones and curses. Markets emptied because no one trusted the food, the merchants, or the strangers who carried them. Even burial became a source of distrust. Gravediggers, overwhelmed by the sheer number of corpses, often looted the bodies of the dead before tossing them into mass graves. Families wept not only for the loss of their loved ones, but for the indignities done to them in death. Chroniclers wrote of towns where silence reigned, broken only by the rumble of death carts and the sobs of widows. The clamor of bells, once used to mark festivals and weddings, now rang only for death and eventually fell silent too, when no one was left to ring them. Life itself seemed suspended. Time no longer felt like seasons or years, but like an endless night. The plague did not simply kill bodies, it dismantled the world people had built. The bonds of kinship, the authority of kings, the sanctity of faith. What remained was a hollowed Europe, trembling not only from loss, but from the knowledge that everything they had trusted could vanish overnight. The Black Death had already slain millions, but its cruelest work was done not with boils or fevers, but with silence, suspicion, and abandonment. It had turned the world upside down, leaving society unmoored, broken and afraid. Europe was no longer a continent of kingdoms and churches, but of graves and ghosts. And yet, in that ruin, strange new movements began to stir voices of desperation, cries for mercy, and rituals of madness that promised redemption. In the ruins of Europe, where silence hung over villages and churches stood empty, something strange began to stir. The plague had broken families, toppled rulers, and silenced priests, but it had not extinguished the human need for meaning. Out of the ashes of despair, movements of desperation emerged, wild and fevered, clinging to the belief that if medicine and kings could not save them, then perhaps blood, prayer, and spectacle would. It began with whispers of divine punishment. People looked at the endless graves and saw not just disease, but God's wrath made flesh. The plague, they believed, was no accident. It was judgment. And if judgment had come, then repentance must follow. But the usual forms of repentance, confession, fasting, prayer, seemed hollow when priests themselves had fled or died. The rituals of the church felt powerless, their prayers unanswered. Something more dramatic, more visible, more punishing was needed. Bands of men began to march from town to town, barefoot and robed, their faces grim and their eyes burning with conviction. These were the Flagellants. Wherever they went, they drew crowds. In public squares they gathered, and in unison they fell to their knees, chanting hymns that echoed against the stone walls. Then they stripped off their shirts and began to lash themselves with whips tipped in iron, tearing open their flesh until blood streamed down their backs and soaked the earth. The crowd gasped, some recoiling in horror, others weeping in awe. Here, they believed, was true sacrifice. Here were men so devoted that they would shed their own blood to plead for mercy from God. The spectacle spread like wildfire, almost as fast as the plague itself. Cities opened their gates to processions of Flagellants, who marched through the streets in long lines, their songs mingling with the toll of funeral bells. People dropped to their knees as the whips cracked through the air, as the men punished themselves for the sins of mankind. Many believed these rituals would save their towns, that the spilling of blood would appease the heavens. And for a moment, in the rhythm of chants and the sight of bodies broken willingly, people felt a fragile hope. But hope quickly turned to unease. The church, already weakened, saw its authority threatened. The Flagellants rejected priests, ignored bishops, and proclaimed their suffering more holy than any sacrament. They claimed to carry letters from God, declaring that their bloodshed could cleanse the world. Crowds followed them, abandoning churches, believing salvation could be found not in mass or confession, but in the whips of these wandering zealots. For a time, their processions outshone the altars of the church itself. Desperation took many forms, and not all of them marched. Some people retreated deeper into private rituals, clutching amulets, reciting charms, lighting fires that were supposed to cleanse the air. Others turned to astrology, begging the stars to reveal why death fell so heavily upon them. But in every case there was a common thread, a frantic search for control, a way to wrestle with a terror that could not be seen, predicted, or stopped. Yet for all their fervor, the Flagellants did nothing to halt the plague. The bodies kept piling higher, villages continued to empty, and in their wake, suspicion followed them. Their processions spread the disease faster as crowds gathered close, breathing the same poisoned air. Their songs of penance became shouts of blame, often turning against Jewish communities, whom they accused of causing the pestilence. Wherever they marched, the air grew thick, not just with blood and incense, but with fear and hatred. Chroniclers wrote of cities that once welcomed them with reverence, later driving them out in disgust, realizing their rituals brought no salvation, only more death. The church condemned them, declaring their practices heretical. By the late 1340s, papal bulls denounced them as dangerous fanatics, and in many places their processions were outlawed. But the memory of their madness lingered, rows of men bleeding in the streets, crowds crying out in desperation, the human hunger for meaning etched into every lash of the whip. Faith itself was fractured. For some, the plague confirmed their belief that the world was under God's judgment, and they doubled down on rituals, processions, and prayers. For others, it destroyed their faith entirely. If God allowed such horror, what power could he possibly hold? The Black Death was not only killing bodies, it was tearing apart the spiritual foundation of medieval Europe, leaving behind a continent not just wounded, but disillusioned. And yet, even in that darkness, strange transformations were brewing. The collapse of the old order created space for new ideas. The silence of the church left a vacuum that would one day be filled by movements of reform and revolution. But in the heart of the plague years, all that people could see was the lash, the blood, and the silence of a God who did not answer. The world was unraveling, and with it the very soul of Europe. The world was unraveling, and with it the very soul of Europe. But even in the darkness, history does not stop. Out of ruin, new shapes begin to form. Out of silence, new voices rise. The Black Death had not only killed millions, it had burned away the foundations of the old order, leaving behind a scarred but altered continent. And in the space where faith and certainty had collapsed, Europe began to change. When the pestilence finally loosened its grip, the survivors emerged into a world they no longer recognized. Whole villages were gone, their fields overgrown with weeds, their homes crumbling into silence. In the cities, neighborhoods stood abandoned, houses boarded and empty, their last inhabitants buried in the pits beyond the walls. Yet among the ruins there was an eerie sense of opportunity, for where once there had been too many mouths to feed and too many hands competing for work, now there was a strange abundance. Land lay idle, crops spoiled without farmers, and the few who remained found themselves in demand. Peasants who had once bent their backs under the lash of their lords now discovered they could bargain. With labor scarce, wages rose. Serfs walked away from the estates where their families had been bound for generations, seeking better terms from desperate landlords. Many found freedom for the first time, their chains loosened not by revolution, but by the scythe of disease. The Black Death had broken not only bodies, but the feudal system itself, cracking its foundations in ways no rebellion ever had. For the nobility, the shift was shocking. Fortunes crumbled as rents dried up and laborers demanded pay. Some lords clung to their power with cruelty, enforcing laws to bind workers to the land. But the tide could not be held back. The imbalance created by death itself had rewritten the rules, and no decree could reverse it. Beneath the horror of loss, a quiet revolution was unfolding. The church, once unquestioned in its authority, bore scars just as deep. Priests who had fled in fear were remembered with bitterness. Monasteries stood empty, their libraries gathering dust, their abbots long dead. Faith had not disappeared, but it had been wounded. People no longer looked to Rome with the same blind devotion. If God's chosen shepherds had abandoned their flock, perhaps new paths to salvation must be found. The seeds of doubt planted in these years would one day grow into movements that shook Christendom to its core. Yet the collapse of faith was matched by a flowering of thought. When the plague loosened its grip, survivors began to look at the world with different eyes. The fragility of life was no longer an abstract sermon. It was a truth written in every graveyard, in every silent street. Artists painted death not only as a shadow, but as a companion who danced with kings and peasants alike. Writers reflected on the vanity of wealth, the futility of pride. The medieval obsession with eternity gave way little by little to a fascination with the here and now. Out of the ashes of despair, the early sparks of the Renaissance began to flicker. But the scars were not only spiritual and cultural, they were visible in every corner of daily life. Families who had once numbered 10 now counted only 2. Children grew up among ruins, playing in streets where weeds cracked the cobblestones, where silence had replaced laughter. Survivors carried memories like wounds that never healed, memories of carts laden with the dead, of churches filled with sobs, of nights spent wondering if dawn would ever come. And yet, resilience stirred. Fields were sown again, though fewer hands planted them. Markets reopened, though their stalls stood half empty. Life returned, halting and fragile, but it returned. Humanity, as it always does, clawed its way forward, building anew on the ruins of what had been lost. But Europe was not the same. It could never be the same. The Black Death had shown the terrifying speed with which everything familiar could vanish. It had shown that kings and peasants alike were fragile, that no wall, no crown, no prayer could guarantee safety. And in that revelation, the old world cracked apart. Out of plague, famine, and despair came a Europe forever altered, its faith shaken, its people hardened, its future transformed. The Black Death had ended, but the echoes of its devastation would sound for centuries, shaping economies, faiths, and cultures. Death had stalked every village, but from its shadow emerged a continent reborn, scarred yet restless, haunted yet alive, stumbling toward an uncertain new dawn. The Black Death had ended, but the echoes of its devastation would sound for centuries, shaping economies, faiths, and cultures. Death had stalked every village, but from its shadow emerged a continent reborn, scarred yet restless, haunted yet alive, stumbling toward an uncertain new dawn. And though the plague itself receded, it had carved itself so deeply into memory that it became part of the very DNA of Europe's history. Survivors carried more than scars. They carried new ways of seeing the world. They had witnessed the collapse of families, the silence of villages, the failure of kings and priests, and the rise of strange rituals born of desperation. They had seen how swiftly the familiar could crumble, how fragile the foundations of society truly were. And once you have seen the world unravel, you cannot look at it the same way again. The most enduring legacy was not in the death toll, vast as it was, but in the shifts it forced. Labor, once abundant and cheap, had become precious. The bargaining power of peasants reshaped the economy, breaking centuries-old structures of servitude. Lords who once ruled with iron authority now found themselves negotiating with workers, offering wages and freedoms unthinkable before. The plague had unwittingly opened a door to a new social order. In the marketplace, change was just as visible. With fewer mouths to feed, prices fell. But the scarcity of labor meant artisans and craftsmen could demand higher pay. For the first time, ordinary people began to taste a measure of independence. A world that had once been rigidly stratified was slowly, painfully becoming more fluid. It was not equality, but it was movement, a subtle but profound tilt in the balance of power. Culturally, the memory of the plague was everywhere. In art, skeletal figures danced beside kings and peasants, reminders that death spared no one. The danse macabre became a recurring theme, painted on church walls and etched into manuscripts, a chilling chorus reminding people of mortality. Literature turned inward, grappling with grief and futility, but also with resilience and the brevity of life. From Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the shadow of the plague, to countless sermons, songs, and chronicles, Europe gave voice to its trauma in ways both haunting and cathartic. Faith, too, would never be the same. The plague had revealed the vulnerability of the church, stripping away its aura of invincibility. Many turned away in bitterness, questioning whether God had abandoned them or whether his priests were truly his chosen. Seeds of doubt were sown that would in time grow into great storms: the Reformation, the challenge to Rome's authority, and the rise of new spiritual movements. The Black Death had not destroyed faith, but it had fractured it, leaving cracks that widened in the centuries to come. Science, medicine, and curiosity also began to stir in the wake of devastation. If prayer alone could not save the world, then perhaps knowledge could. Slowly, Europe turned its eyes to study not only the heavens, but the body, the earth, and the invisible forces that carried sickness. It was a fragile beginning, but in that soil lay the roots of a new age of inquiry. Yet alongside these transformations, the memory of fear remained. The plague became a shadow that lingered over every generation. Outbreaks would return in waves, each one reviving the horror, each one reminding Europe that the Black Death was not simply history, but a recurring threat. It was both past and present, a wound that refused to heal. And in whispers, the plague lived on in legend. Families told stories of the dead carts, of the eerie silence, of the wild processions of Flagellants. Towns remembered the years when their streets became graveyards. Chroniclers preserved it all, ink and parchment capturing the darkest chapter of human memory. To live after the Black Death was to inherit its ghost, to walk through a world rebuilt on graves. But perhaps its greatest legacy was psychological. The people of Europe had learned in the most brutal way imaginable that certainty was an illusion. They had been forced to confront mortality in every breath, every glance, every tolling bell. And out of that confrontation came both despair and creativity. Fear gave birth to suspicion, but also to resilience. Death gave birth to mourning, but also to art. The plague was destruction, but it was also transformation, a paradox that reshaped a continent. By the time Europe staggered into the Renaissance, the Black Death was already woven into its foundation. The hunger for beauty, knowledge, and life that defined the new age was born from the memory of death. The urgency to create, to understand, to live fully was sharpened by the memory of how quickly life could be snuffed out. The shadow of the plague stretched long, even as the light of rebirth began to shine. And so, the Black Death lived on, not as a single catastrophe locked in the 14th century, but as a defining moment of human history. Its echo still speaks to us, a reminder of fragility, resilience, and the haunting truth that death is both our greatest fear and our greatest teacher. The bells had stopped tolling, the graves had been filled, but Europe would never forget. And neither should we.